Welcome back. This story is called Dan and Tony. This is a story about my late wife, Susan. When Susan was in her 20s, she worked for these two guys, Dan and Tony. Dan and Tony were criminals. It was organized crime. What they were doing was they were calling elderly people on the phone. They had a boiler room. There were 6 guys in this boiler room, including my late wife's brother. That's how she got in with these two characters, Dan and Tony. And what they did is they had a list. They were cold calling elderly people all over the country and selling them on this fake investment scheme. They made up this whole investment scheme about how they were going to put money in to a what's called a currency exchange against the Japanese yen. It was an option deal where after 30 days, if the dollar was at a certain level against the yen, they would make twice their money. But if the dollar didn't hit a certain point, they would lose their money. It was all made up. There was no investment at all. And of course, every month, every 30 days, these old people would lose all their money because there was no money being invested. The money was going right into Dan and Tony's pockets. And whenever these people would get upset, they would call back and say, "I lost all my money. Why'd you lose all my money?" They would say, "Well, who is your broker?" And they go, "Oh, Chris." And then they'd say, "Oh, Chris isn't here anymore. I'm Mark. And Mark, I'm now your new broker." Well, it was the same guy. They would just always change their name every time they call back. Susan's job was to get on the phone with these old people when they were really, really irate. They were ready to call the feds. And her job was to calm them down, say everything's fine. Mark's your new broker. Chris is no longer here. Steve's no longer here. Charlie's no longer here. Now remember, it's all the same guy. And be sure to reinvest, because if you reinvest, you'll make your money back. That's what they are always doing. They're always telling these people, oh, now you got to reinvest. You got to invest, double. You got to double your money to make all your money back. And they basically cheated people out of their life savings. One time, there was a guy who was in the boiler room, and he decided he was going to leave. He was going to leave Dan and Tony and go do the same thing for some other criminal, somewhere else in Miami. Well, when you're working for organized crime, you don't do that. Okay, they have a very strict non-compete policy. So one night, Susan got a call from Dan and Tony. They said, "Go to the bar, pick up this guy." I think his name was Felipe. Pick up Felipe at 9 o'clock at night. Pick him up at the bar and bring him to the office. Okay. So Susan gets in her car. She goes to the bar. She finds Felipe. She told me he was drunk off his ass. She poured him into the car. She got him into the car. They drove to the office. Get out of the car. Go up to the door. Knock, knock, knock. Door opens. Dan and Tony are in the room. And Susan told me the entire room was covered in plastic. The ceiling was covered in plastic. The floor was covered in plastic. All the walls were covered in plastic. Okay? These guys, Dan and Tony, one thing you have to say about them, they were prepared. And they said to Susan, "Good night, Susan. Thank you." And she left. And that was the last time anyone heard of Felipe. Remember that when you're working for organized crime. Eventually, they got busted. Eventually, the feds came in and broke up the operation. And the feds started questioning all these guys who were working in the boiler room. And all these guys were pointing fingers at each other. Nobody wanted to go to jail. So they were all like, "Oh, he did this, he did that. That's Steve, that's Tom, that's Mark," giving all these names and everything else. And the only person in the entire organization that knew every detail about what was going on was Susan, my late wife, because that's the way she was. She was very smart, very analytical. She knew every detail of this entire operation. She knew where all the money was going. She knew everybody's alias. She knew what Dan and Tony were up to. She knew the whole thing. And earlier in her life, Susan had been questioned by the feds before. Her father was a drug dealer, a big-time drug dealer. He was murdered in a drug deal. And the feds questioned him, questioned all the family members, including Susan when she was 12 years old. Susan knew who did it. He was killed by his own gang, his own crew, jacked him and killed him over drug money. So Susan knew who these people were. But when she got in front of the feds, her mother said to her, "Susan, I don't know is always an acceptable answer." So when the feds started asking her, "Well, who were these people that killed your father?" she said, "I don't know." And that's where she went on. She went on with her life. So the feds are now investigating Dan and Tony. They've got all these interviews going. They've got all the information that they can get out of these guys in the boiler room. Of course, Dan and Tony weren't talking. And then they interviewed Susan. They were ready. Susan said the interview lasted 2 hours because they knew that she was the one who knew all the details of this operation. And every time they asked her a question, she said, I don't know. So when they said, who's Chris? Who's Mark? Who's Steve? She knew all these people. She knew exactly who everyone was. She said, I don't know. And then they got into the nuts and bolts of the operation, the whole thing about the yen and the options and all this, the scheme, the scam that they were running. Every question, Susan said, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. At the end of the day, I don't know what happened to Tony, but Dan paid $5 million to the feds. That was his penalty. $5 million. So you can imagine how much money they made. Did not spend a day in prison because they had nothing to go on, but he paid his $5 million fine and went on with his life. Several years later, several years after the breakup of Dan and Tony, Susan was at a friend's house. Dan was a mutual friend of this woman. He happened to be there at the same time that Susan was there. This was several years after the event. Dan sees Susan at this friend's house. He goes, Susie, I've got something to show you. I've got something in my truck to show you. Now, usually at this point in the story, I ask the audience, I say, can anybody guess what Dan had in his truck? Of course, nobody can guess what Dan had in his truck. I knew what he had in his truck. Dan comes back with a transcript, okay? It was a written, typed transcript of Susan's interview with the feds. She said it was about 2 inches thick. It was a 2-hour interview. And Dan brought this transcript. I don't know how he got it. I mean, it was some part of his case. Maybe his lawyer got it for him. Anyway, he had this thing, this transcript. Why it was in his truck, I have no idea, but he had it. He opens it up. He had a Post-it note, like on page 167. He opens it up, and it's all the questions that they were asking Susan about the nuts and bolts of the operation, the details of what Dan and Tony were doing. And it went on for like 3 pages. Every single question they asked her, same response. I don't know. I don't know. So now Dan's got this transcript and he's reading it. He's reading it out loud to Susan. He's reading what the questions were. He's reading the answer. I don't know. I don't know. And he's laughing. He's laughing his ass off. He reads like the 3 pages to her. And then he says, Susie, you saved my ass. I would have gone to prison if you had told these guys what you knew. And she said, hey, boss, just another day at the office. And they went on their separate ways. And she still stayed in touch with Dan even to this day. So that's the story of Dan and Tony. Don't forget to read my book, Broccoli Time by Dante Allen, available now on Amazon Books.